Good afternoon and welcome to Shooting Straight with me, Voice of the Forge. You can find me on this YouTube channel, Voice of the Forge, or on Twitter at Voice of the Forge. Now today I'm going to talk about something which may or may not stimulate a lot of conversation. I will state that I have picked a provocative title for a very specific reason, and I hope that this generates some debate about what it means. Before I go any further, I will say that this has not been an easy video for me to make. I have asked myself why I wanted to make it and why I say the things that I do. Now, to me, it doesn't matter if I am watched by one person or 1,000. Making these kind of videos can be seen as narcissistic to expect people to pick up my viewpoint from the background of millions of people who use the internet on a daily basis. Now, my reason for making videos is because I am quite heavily medicated, and with my depression and anxiety, I feel that I can't do certain things. So in order for me to feel that I'm making some kind of progress, to me these videos represent a body of work that, despite the handicap that I have in terms of actually speaking, going out and doing things, I have managed to overcome that hurdle. And this becomes important with regards to not only the reason why I've chosen the title that I've chosen, but my views on this. Now, you will notice that unlike other platforms, I will not be removing my comments section, and the ratings system will be untouched. Now, why is this important? Well, the title of this video is Speech Isn't Free. This is something that is anathema to the modern world, where we believe that free speech is everything. But the fact of the matter is, we don't have freedom of speech. Because what is freedom of speech? To have freedom of something is to also have freedom from it. This is an argument that we've had from the atheist community. And yet we are bombarded every day with sights and sounds, commentaries, documentaries and news stories about the world around us, which means that we don't have freedom from speech. Now, some would say that we have freedom from hate speech, but we don't, because, again, in these news stories, we still see people who wish to cause us harm. We still see people who wish to denigrate us as a community, as individuals, as a hobby, especially as a gamer. We still have this bent that we are somehow all misogynistic, hateful people, purely because of a hobby that we all enjoy. Now, people will say, so what? This is nothing to do with freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is all about being able to say what you want to say. And I agree that we are allowed to say what we say, but the fundamental point of freedom, that means that it has no cost, is fundamentally flawed. Now, I am of an opinion that we all have an opinion, but opinions are like assholes. We all have one. And some people are more informed than others, and this is not a value claim that I am making any more or less than I am for myself. As I've said, I make these videos purely as an exercise so that I can look back at it and say, yeah, okay, I've had this long struggling with this problem and I've still been able to do something. But freedom of speech isn't free, because there is always a cost associated with it. Now, that cost might be minuscule. For me, making this video, that cost is the time and energy that goes into speaking, and then adding the video component on top of the audio that makes this video what it is. So that is still a cost, and I would have that cost whether or not I was speaking to this microphone, whether I'm speaking on a street corner or merely speaking to my friends. So the time is a cost. And whilst people will turn around and say, oh yes, that's very basic, very clever, you've managed to twist the meaning of freedom of speech, I think this is a fundamental principle. At its most basic, we have the time and energy it takes to say the words and to formulate the thoughts that go into those words. But that is the most basic cost. You've then got to look at everything else that goes into what makes that speech viable. Now, yes, we can all make it purely about the biological energy, the thought process and everything else, but let's think about it on a cultural level. I have made videos that people may or may not like. I have a number of subscribers that that obviously like what I'm saying enough to subscribe to my channel, so that when a new video comes out, they will take the time to listen. They have invested time into hearing what I've got to say, and if they don't like what I say, then they will unsubscribe, they will move away, they will find someone else who they listen to and have a more like-for-like viewpoint. So cost can also mean that we alienate people in our social circle. Now there's one person that I'm hoping to have on a discussion one day, where he's going to come around here and we're going to record a video together, and he's been active in my comments, and he happens to be someone that I know in real life, and he disagrees with 95% of my comment. He disagrees with all of the salient points, but some of the most important. He doesn't like the way in which I arrive at my conclusion, but at the same time he can understand why my conclusions are what they are. He just draws a different conclusion from the same evidence. And a lot of people would shout that down and say, oh this and all that and all the other. But basically what it means is that we have two different viewpoints from the same evidence. And the speech that encourages, when we can get together and actually debate each other in a civilised manner, because at the end of the day we're quite happy sitting down over a KFC, which in itself is something that can be quite controversial, and talk about the videos that I've made. And he sometimes makes comments on the comment section as well. Now the idea is that these videos stimulate debate, and it has worked in at least one person in my social circle. But that speech hasn't been free. It has a consequence to it. It has a consequence that people might not like what I say. And that means that, say for instance, someone just decides to thumb down the video, that is a cost that I have borne on myself. I have invited that commentary. I have invited people to either disagree with me or agree with me, because I am not holding these values in the silence of my skull. I am not keeping the thoughts to myself. I am expressing them. And because I express them, then they have a cost for other people. One, at the most basic, is the energy to hear and interact. Two is the energy that they then apply to then formulate a response. But at the end of the day, even when we take it away from the most basic building blocks, we have a social and cultural cost to what we say. Now many people will say that the only answer to hate speech is more speech, and I fully agree. Give people a platform to be hateful. Give people a platform to go out there, show their ideas off, and when they are shown to be so far outside of the mainstream, when they are shown to be so extreme that no one else can, with good conscience, actually agree with them, then this is where the cost comes in. They are ostracised from society. They are they're not disbarred from speaking, but no one wants to listen to them. They can book all the conference halls they like, they can make all the seminars they wish, but if they are so far out of the extreme that no one wants to go, or they don't have enough people to make it viable, then that isn't censorship. That has been the cost of their speech. They are free in order to make the speech, but the speech itself isn't consequence free. And this is where I believe that we get mixed up with the freedom of speech issue. Now, my issue with all of this is very different to someone from the United States. As you can possibly tell from my accent, I am not from the United States, I'm from the UK. And freedom of speech in the UK is far more curtailed in terms of what you can and can't say without sanction. Now, why do those sanctions exist? Well, the sanctions exist because, as a society, we have decided that certain things are so beyond the pale that no one in good conscience could agree with them, and therefore we have codified certain things as being illegal, which means that we have a cost principle in terms of you can say what you want and you bear the brunt of the public response. In other words, publish and be damned, which is a very fine quote, which is often used. And then we have the society that has turned round and said, actually, we believe that certain kinds of speech are so far beyond what we would want as a society that we have codified them into a set of laws so that people know that society isn't going to waste the time and the effort constantly having to refute people who come up with these ideas. And therefore we have certain words which are no longer socially acceptable. Both in the US and in the UK, we can all think of at least one where if you say that in certain societies there will be an intake of breath and I can't believe you just said that. And that may apply to different groups of persons, or it may be to one specific group of persons, and it may be a more global first world thing than people realise. So now you can see where I'm coming from. I've come from this from an oblique angle. I've taken the word freedom and I have used it to imply something else. But I have then taken this logically to then say, if we look at the costs of what we have as a society, this is why we have laws. There is a cost to every action, there is a cost to every word uttered. And when we come to laws, these are things that over a period of time have been built up to make a society more able to turn around and say, this is acceptable, this isn't. And it's not like a lot of these things have been arbitrarily mapped out. These things, in many cases, have taken many hundreds of years. And when we have people that say certain things, then they run afoul of these laws. Now, one of these things is where we actually are prejudiced and discriminate against colour, sexual orientation, the way in which people look is now becoming more codified in laws, with some police forces in England and Wales now identifying subcultures as being worthy of protection from certain attacks. And the most prominent, I believe, is in the Manchester area, is the subculture of the goth lifestyle. So where we've had people that have been murdered purely for being goth, they are now looking at protecting that subculture. Now, this is a cost that society has to bear. And when we start looking at these costs, sometimes costs become too much. And these costs, when they become too much, they curtail too much speech, which means that we're then starting to look at a society which is becoming totalitarian. It is deciding not to spend the energy to turn around and say, that's offensive. They just blanket everything and go, no, you can't say that, end of story. So the freedom of speech is a two-way thing. You have the freedom to say what you want, but you are not free from consequence. And this is the bit that people stumble over. Every time we open our mouths and we say something, there is a consequence. Whether it's saying good morning to someone or being polite in a financial transaction in a shop, that is a cost. It doesn't cost you much, but it has a consequence. Now, that consequence might be very beneficial. It might well be that the shopping clerk that you've just been very polite to, they feel a little bit better about themselves because you've been a nice customer. Or it could be that you've been a total prick and you've shouted and stamped your feet and demanded your rights because you know the Sale of Goods Act better than they do on customer service, and you've just managed to wear them down just that little bit more. These are all costs, these are all consequences, and we forget that when we talk about such a thing as freedom of speech, there is no such thing as a freedom from consequence of speech. Now, a lot of what Gamergate has been over the last year is holding to account those websites such as Gawker that have said we can say what we like, and they've turned around and said yes you can, but your advertisers may not like it, and because your advertisers may not like it, you don't get to say what you want to say and have them pay for it. And people have turned around and called that censorship. I don't. I call that the cost of your view. Now, recently, a couple of weeks ago, I put up a video about migration in the EU. And I had to think long and hard as to whether or not I had the courage of my convictions. Because it was, right, this is a controversial issue. This is something that may very well stir a lot of debate. It may well sink without a trace, like a pebble in a pond, which is fair enough. But at the same time, I also realised that I may alienate a lot of people that have followed me for the Gamergate content. I may alienate a lot of people. I may attract a completely different crowd when I publish this video, and they may hate what it is that I have to say. And I had to weigh that cost to myself, weigh that cost into the work that I'd built up with the previous videos, and say, do I want to bear the consequences? Now, obviously, I published the video, so I felt it was worthwhile what I had to say, taking a slightly different viewpoint on what was happening, and going, this is my opinion, this is the way I see it. And likewise with this video, I have taken a slightly different position, and I am building logically an argument to say that when we look at freedom of speech, we look at it quite often from a myopic point of view, where we only consider the freedom to say things. Now, when we talk about the freedom to say things, we very rarely think about the actual cost to say things, the consequences of what we say, and what they may be. Now, we are very social creatures, and this social interaction is very dear to us. Very few of us can survive in isolation as loners with no or very little human contact. So, the fact that we may alienate people, the fact that we may be ostracised, is a powerful demotivator to certain kinds of speech. But when we have people that feel free to say what on earth they like as and when they say it and everything else, that's when we see the rise of extremism, both in the far right and in the far left, in the Muslim communities and everywhere else. They have a body of supporters, which means that their consequences are minimised, or they're fed, where they go, right on, we agree with you, we will support you. So, much like saying thank you to a cashier, we reinforce that cost. That cost has actually become a benefit. And that is where the whole point of freedom of speech is not free. Excuse me a second. Right, point of the shooting straight is that I do this in one take with no breaks, no editing, and this is purely unvarnished me talking. So I apologise for that small break. Anyway, back to what I was saying. Speech has a cost, and we as a society have gotten so used to having the idea of freedom of speech that we have forgotten that there are costs involved with it. When someone has something like a hashtag that says kill all white men, it has a racial connotation, and that is part of the reason why, under the malicious communications, she is being investigated. Now, the problem is we are talking about someone going to jail for their speech. We are talking about someone who is going to get prosecuted for their speech, which isn't the same thing. To put it in perspective with UK law, there are various things that you can't do, and the best example that I'll quickly run down the Public Order Act. Now, everyone knows the most serious of the Public Order Act offences, which is riot. We all know what a riot is. We've all seen them in Ferguson, we've seen them in 2011 in the UK. We've seen people trashing cars and throwing objects at police, being violent and generally vile. And if we look at Sweden as another example, we have had many nights of rioting and everything else there in certain parts of Stockholm, Gothenburg, and this hasn't been reported widely on the media. Why? Because they want to push a narrative of Sweden as this wonderful paradise where everyone's egalitarian and everyone is equal and the most multicultural country there is. And with the influence of migrants and things that have happened in Sweden, all of a sudden Sweden's burning, and they don't want that to be seen. This is another consequence of freedom of speech. People who are pushing an agenda, who have a loud voice, drown out all the lesser voices. Anyway, I digress. We know what a riot is. Right. The second one, Section 2 of the Public Order Act, is violent disorder. Now this is where we have something that looks like a riot, but has about 12 people. And you could call it a mini riot, but the legal standing is very much different, and most of the times when there has been something that looks like a riot, you'll hear that people have been charged with violent disorder. And this is a technical legal thing, which basically absolves the police of not losing control. But that's a separate issue. Section 3 of the Public Order Act is what's called a fray. Now, a fray is where 3 or more people are fighting. Doesn't matter what the reasons are, you've got 3 or more people and they're having a fight. So think a bar fight, think certain smaller skirmishes at football matches and everything else. Now you will see quite rapidly that the actual level of violence involved has dropped quite rapidly. You've got riot, which can involve hundreds of people. Then you've got violent disorder, which requires 12. And then you've got a fray, which requires 3. Now, Section 4 of the Public Order Act is another massive drop in scale, because Section 4 is threatening or trying to provoke violence. And this is pretty much body language, speech, and other things that someone can do to try and start a fight, trying to provoke another person into a fight. And of course, where you have someone who is threatening, then you've also got that part of it. Now, I'll skip Section 4A for a moment and you'll find out why once I've told you what Section 5 is. Now, so far you can see that there is a massive drop each time in the level of violence and the level of control needed in order to police that particular offence. Now, Section 5 is merely using speech or actions which can cause another person of reasonable standing harassment, alarm and distress. Now this ruling, this law has been modified a couple of times recently because it got too silly. We had instances of people being arrested for telling a policeman his horse was gay. Let that sink in for a minute. We had someone arrested under Section 5 of the Public Order Act for telling a police officer his horse was gay. And that's because they removed a word. And I believe it was something along the lines of ridicule or along those lines. And they've removed it so that it goes back to what it was originally when the Public Order Act was formed, which is harassment, alarm and distress. Now let's look at what harassment, alarm and distress are. Now, harassment. We all know what things harassment is. Things that cause people anxiety, stress and continue over a period of time. Alarm. You've done something and they are alarmed. Well, that could be many different things and can be different, and it's different for me as it is to anybody else. And then, of course, we have the word distress. So you have alarm and distress. Very subjective, widely vary depending on individuals, and that is all it takes for you to be arrested under the Public Order Act. And to show you, say for instance you were walking down the street with your mates, and you are pushing and shoving each other on the pavement and you're swearing fit to make a sailor blush. A police officer sees you and he can issue you under this act with a warning to stop. And you have to. If you do something else which could also incite harassment, alarm or distress in a reasonable person, or you continue with the same behaviour, then you can be arrested. End of. Think how powerful and how abusive that power can be. And that is how curtailed freedom of speech really is. Because just swearing in the wrong place, at the wrong time, for the wrong amount, can land you in a police cell and in front of a magistrate. This is important. It's in front of a magistrate. We're not talking Crown Court. We're not talking a jury. You're talking about a magistrate and you get a slap on the wrist and a fine. Yes, it's a criminal conviction. But then so is drunk driving, so is jumping a red light, so is committing a U-turn where you're not allowed to, so is riding a bicycle where prohibited, which is usually the pavement if you actually look at the highway code. This is the level at which the laws are being applied. There are laws which are huge. Murder, manslaughter, rape. Then you have laws like Affray, where you've got to protect the public good. And then you have laws which have a consequence for your speech. No one would argue that America doesn't have freedom of speech because of jaywalking. But I was just expressing myself by not crossing where there was a crossing. Doesn't matter, it's an absolute offence, jaywalking. The same thing is true in the UK. If you do things which are contrary to a certain set of laws, whether it's carrying a pointed and bladed article under Section 137 of the Criminal Justice Act, whether it's getting into a fight and hurting people, such as Affray, or getting involved in a much larger action, such as violent disorder, or walking down the street and really harassing and intimidating people, then there is a consequence to your behaviour and a consequence to your actions. And this is where malicious communications has come in. Now, this law predates the internet. It came in 1988 and was designed originally to be partially helpful for people who had stalkers. People who would phone up on a landline before we had mobile phones and breathe heavily down the phone at people. We have it in sort of murder shows and films where the killer will phone up and just say nothing, and all you can hear is breathing or silence before hanging up again. Well, this was a major problem in the late 80s, early 90s, and it caused no end of women a lot of distress. So they brought in an offence where using a phone to do that sort of thing was a malicious communication, just as much as writing someone a letter saying, I hope you fall off a cliff and die, 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 and if you don't, I will come and push you off, which was letter-based. The thing is, the Act doesn't actually take into consideration the method in which the language and the speech was used. So, with the arrival of the internet and social media, the Malicious Communications Act still stands. And if you say or do something which falls afoul of this Act, then you can be prosecuted. Now, under the language used, this diversity officer from Goldsmiths has been charged and summonsed. Now, you are summonsed when you commit a road traffic accident, when you commit a road traffic offence, such as jumping a red light. Now, it could well be that you're giving a ticket instead. Now, all the ticket is a shortcut that has been agreed by the Criminal Prosecution Society in this country, whereby you don't go through the laborious process of issuing the summons, but you issue an on-the-spot fine. And it has also been brought in for drunk and disorderly as well, where you can have an on-the-spot fine if you're behaving in a certain way on the street because you're drunk. And this is the level of offence that she's broken. It's not like she's going to be jailed as a political prisoner because of what she said. It's the fact that her speech has consequences. And as a consequence, she now has to stand up in front of a magistrate and defend what she said. That is it. Now, I hope that I haven't rambled on too long, and I hope that you take my point that speech isn't free. We have to think about it, and we have to consider that every time we speak, there is a cost, either to ourselves or to somebody else. And this is something that is not widely acknowledged, and I think it's about time we did. I thank you for listening, and I hope that it stimulates debate. I hope that I haven't offended too many people, because at the end of the day, I'm not someone that wants to offend. I just hold a very specific view and opinion, and my opinion is like anybody else's. If I just use more facts to back it up, that just means that I've got a slightly more informed opinion. I will leave it there. I am, as always, Voice of the Forge. You can follow me on Twitter, you can follow me on YouTube, and you can also find me at the Forgotten Forge Games part of Facebook. And we also have our own website, Forgotten